Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about sensory issues,
Okay.
and particularly in the context of autism. And this was inspired by an article that one of our listeners sent in
Right.
called "Debunking the Myth: Exposure Therapy Won't Cure Sensory Issues."
Mm.
And it's from the website Cheap ABA. Have you heard of this website before?
Yeah, I have actually. It's a really great resource
Oh, wow.
for anyone who's either, autistic or has family members, friends who are autistic or works with autistic people.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of really good articles and resources.
That's cool. I've heard a lot about exposure therapy for anxiety,
Hmm.
but can it really cure something like sensory processing?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And the article kind of jumps right into this.
Okay.
This big misconception that sensory issues are just fears that you can overcome.
Right. Right.
But it's really a lot more complex than that.
So help me understand this distinction a little bit better.
Sure.
What's the difference between like being afraid of something and having a sensory issue with it?
Okay, so think of it this way.
Okay.
A fear is like a psychological response
Hmm.
to something that you think is threatening.
Okay.
But a sensory issue is rooted in how your brain actually processes stimuli. So it's a physiological response.
Yeah.
And that can lead to feeling uncomfortable pain or feeling overwhelmed.
Okay. That makes a lot more sense. So it's not just mind over matter.
Right.
Like you can't just will yourself to not be bothered by something.
Exactly.
The article uses this really powerful analogy
Yes.
about ignoring the pain from a pinprick. Like you might learn to dissociate,
Mhm.
but the pain is still there.
Exactly.
So what does that actually look like with sensory overload?
Well, if you're pushing someone into sensory overload without giving them tools or ways to manage it,
Right.
it can lead to burnout, it can lead to anxiety, it can even lead to physical harm.
Wow.
It's like if you break your leg and you just keep walking on it, you might be able to distract yourself from the pain for a while, but you're not actually healing the injury.
Okay, so dissociation is a big red flag here.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a little bit more for me? Like,
Yeah.
what does that actually mean, and why is it so problematic?
So dissociation is essentially a disconnect between your thoughts,
Mhm.
your feelings, your memories,
Yeah.
and even your sense of self.
Okay.
There are different types of dissociation, but in this context, it's likely that the person is detaching from the overwhelming sensory input as a way of coping with it.
As a coping mechanism.
As a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
Exactly. But the problem is that if you rely on dissociation long term, it can actually make it harder for you to process
Oh, wow.
and manage sensory input effectively.
So it's making it worse in the long run
right.
if you're just trying to tough it out.
Yeah, you're not actually addressing the root of the problem.
Okay, so if exposure therapy isn't the answer, what are some things that people can do to feel more comfortable?
Yeah.
The article mentions a few alternatives. I was really interested in what it said about stimming, because there's often a negative perception around stimming.
Yeah.
But this article frames it as a really valuable tool.
It is a valuable tool.
Can you break that down for us?
Yeah.
What is stimming, and how can it help with sensory regulation?
So stimming is when you're engaging in repetitive movements or sounds. Like
what?
So think of things like rocking back and forth, fidgeting with your hands, humming,
Okay.
or even looking at patterns over and over.
Okay, so it could be visual too.
It could be visual, yeah.
Yeah.
And this might seem odd to neurotypical people,
Mm-hmm.
but for neurodivergent people, especially those with autism, stimming can be really beneficial.
And just to clarify,
Yeah.
when we say neurodivergent,
Mm-hmm.
we mean people whose brains
Mm.
function differently from what is considered neurotypical,
Exactly.
like the typical way that most people's brains work.
Right.
Okay, so for someone who stims, it's not just a random behavior they're doing.
Right.
It's actually serving a purpose.
Exactly. It's not something to be discouraged
Yeah.
or suppressed. It helps to regulate sensory input,
Oh, okay.
reduce anxiety, and even improve focus.
Wow. Yeah.
Think about it like this.
All right.
If you are feeling overwhelmed in a noisy environment,
Mhm.
you might put on headphones to block out the sound,
Right.
right? So that's a form of sensory regulation.
Okay.
Stimming serves a similar purpose. It helps the individual to manage their sensory experience and feel more comfortable.
So it's about finding ways to modify the environment
Mm-hmm.
and create a sensory experience that works for you.
Exactly.
And stimming is one way to do that.
Right.
The article also mentioned sensory tools,
Yeah.
like those noise-canceling headphones you just mentioned.
Yeah, sensory tools can be super helpful. Things like sunglasses to reduce visual stimulation,
Okay.
earplugs if you're sensitive to noise, weighted blankets if you crave that sense of pressure
Interesting.
and grounding.
It seems like it's about
Mhm.
individualizing the approach
It is.
and finding what works best for each person.
Yeah, and giving people options and not forcing them to conform to a sensory experience that's not working for them.
That makes a lot of sense. This brings up an interesting question, though.
Okay.
Are there any cases where exposure therapy might be helpful when it comes to sensory issues?
That is a nuanced point that the article brings up.
Okay.
It's not about using exposure therapy to get rid of the sensory issue itself,
Okay.
but rather to address any fears that the person might have surrounding the sensory experience.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so imagine someone who has severe sensory sensitivities and they're terrified of having a meltdown in public
Okay.
because they don't know how people are going to react. So in that case, exposure therapy combined with other strategies like stimming and sensory tools might help them manage that fear of having a meltdown.
Okay, so it's not about forcing them to endure the sensory overload,
Right.
but rather helping them to cope with the anxiety and fear
The anxiety and fear, exactly.
that comes with it.
Yeah, the focus is still on managing the sensory experience itself,
Right.
but exposure therapy might be used as a way to support that person in dealing with the emotional distress around it.
So it's like a supplemental type of therapy.
But it's important that this is done very carefully,
Yeah.
ethically, always putting the person's well-being first.
Right.
And making sure that they feel empowered and in control.
I see. This has been really helpful. I think the key takeaway here is that we need to understand sensory issues,
Yes.
like what they are,
Yes.
and that exposure therapy is not a one-size-fits-all solution.
I completely agree. It's about recognizing that sensory issues are real.
Yeah.
They're valid, and they deserve to be addressed with compassion and understanding.
We've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
but we're just getting started. We are going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back to dive even deeper into this fascinating topic.
Oh.
So, one thing that really stuck with me from the article was this idea of the autism tax. It's such a powerful way to describe the extra effort that autistic individuals have to put in just to navigate a world that wasn't really designed for them.
It really is like a tax, right? It's like a series of invisible hurdles that they're constantly having to jump over.
And it can be exhausting, I imagine.
It is exhausting. Yeah, it can impact every area of your life.
So can you give some specific examples of how this tax might show up in someone's life?
Sure. So think about the mental energy it takes to constantly be filtering out overwhelming sensory input.
Especially in a crowded, noisy environment.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Or think about the effort that it takes to mask autistic traits, to fit in socially, which can lead to burnout and anxiety.
It's like you're constantly running a mental marathon.
You are. You're constantly on.
And I think this really ties back into the article's call.
It does.
For more understanding, acceptance of neurodiversity. We need to create spaces where everyone can thrive regardless of how their brain works.
Yes, and we need to shift from this mindset of fixing or curing to a mindset of celebrating and accommodating differences.
Yeah, imagine a world where stimming is seen as a natural way to... Sensory tools are readily available. Communication differences are embraced rather than judged.
That would be amazing. It would be such a different world.
Speaking of misconceptions, the article also debunks this idea that autistic individuals lack empathy.
Yes.
Which I know is a very harmful stereotype.
It's completely false. Autistic people might express empathy differently, but that doesn't mean that they don't have it.
Yeah, it's not that they don't care.
Exactly.
It's that they might struggle to recognize social cues or maybe express emotions in conventional ways.
Yes.
The article mentions this concept of double empathy, which I thought was really fascinating.
It's a really helpful concept.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so it's basically talking about the communication gap
Okay.
that often exists between neurotypical people and neurodivergent people. It's like two people who speak different languages trying to have conversation.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, there's going to be some miscommunication and some frustration.
Right.
But it's not because either person lacks empathy.
Yeah.
It's because they're just not on the same wavelength.
That's not anyone's fault.
Right.
It's just a difference.
Exactly.
And this leads into another really important point that the article raises.
Okay.
Which is the challenges of masking.
Yes.
So autistic individuals often feel pressure to hide their autistic traits to fit in.
Right.
Which can be really draining, I would imagine.
It is. It's like you're putting on a performance all the time.
Right.
Trying to anticipate what people expect of you. And it's exhausting.
It's no wonder it leads to exhaustion and burnout.
Yeah. And it can have some really serious consequences, particularly for women.
Oh, yeah.
So the article talks about how masking can lead to underdiagnosis.
Interesting.
Because women might not fit the stereotypical image of autism, and their struggles might be overlooked.
It must be heartbreaking.
It is.
To be misunderstood and unsupported simply because you become so good at adapting to a world that wasn't really built for you.
Right. It's tragic.
It really highlights the importance of recognizing that there's such a diversity of autistic experiences.
Yes.
And ensuring that our diagnostic criteria are inclusive of all those different ways that autism can present.
Yeah, especially for people who are skilled at masking.
Right, because they're so good at hiding it.
Exactly.
So what can we do, both individually and as a society, to create a more supportive environment for autistic people?
Well, the article emphasizes the power of education, advocacy, and acceptance.
Okay.
We need to challenge stereotypes, provide resources, and really promote understanding.
It starts with listening.
It does.
And believing autistic individuals.
Yeah.
When they share their experiences
Absolutely.
and amplifying their voices.
Yes.
Advocating alongside them.
It's about empowering autistic people to speak up for their needs and advocate for themselves, whether it's, the right to stim or to use sensory tools or to communicate in ways that feel authentic to them.
So it's about moving beyond tolerance.
It is.
Into a culture of acceptance.
Yes.
And celebration.
Yeah.
Of neurodiversity.
Beautifully said.
Recognizing that it's not a deficit, but a valuable asset.
Yes.
That brings unique perspectives and strengths to our communities.
I love that reframing.
Me too. This conversation has given me so much to reflect on.
Me too. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play.
Yeah.
Creating a more inclusive world.
An equitable world for everyone.
Yeah.
There's one more point from the article I want to highlight.
Okay.
Before we wrap up. It emphasizes that autism is a spectrum.
Yes.
And experiences can vary so widely.
Right.
We can't make assumptions about what it means to be autistic.
Yeah.
Based on stereotypes.
Yes.
Or limited representation.
Absolutely. We need to recognize the individuality of each person's experience.
Exactly. And tailor our support and our understanding accordingly.
I agree.
So it all comes back to listening, learning.
Yeah.
And approaching these conversations with humility.
Yes.
And a genuine desire to create a world that works for everyone.
Absolutely.
We've covered a lot of ground here. And it's clear that there's still so much to explore and learn.
There is.
But we're going to take a quick pause to gather our thoughts. And then we'll be right back to wrap up this deep dive with some final reflections and a question to leave you pondering. And we're back for our final thoughts on sensory issues and exposure therapy. This article makes it pretty clear that exposure therapy doesn't really work when it comes to sensory issues.
I think that the author is really pushing for a shift in focus.
Yeah, what do you mean?
So instead of trying to make people get over their sensitivities, they're saying let's focus on management strategies and self-care strategies that actually improve their quality of life. Okay, so like giving them the tools to handle things better.
Yeah, empower them to find what works best for them, whether that's stimming or using sensory tools or asking for accommodations.
It just seems like common sense. But it's amazing how often people are told to just toughen up or get used to it.
Yeah, it really speaks to the need for more awareness and education around neurodiversity.
Yeah.
Sensory issues are not a weakness or a flaw. They're just a natural part of how some people experience the world.
This whole conversation makes me wonder, how can we as a society become more aware of and sensitive to the diverse sensory needs of individuals?
That's a great question. I think it starts with education.
Okay.
And challenging our own assumptions.
Yeah.
We need to be open to learning from autistic people and their families, amplifying their voices and advocating for change.
So moving beyond just tolerance
Yes.
into actual inclusion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Creating spaces where everyone feels safe, respected, and empowered to be themselves. That's a great point. Well, this has been such an insightful discussion. If you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend checking out the Cheap ABA website.
Yeah, they've got a lot of great stuff on there.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into sensory issues. We hope you learned something new and will continue to explore this important topic. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.